Welcome to Feel Good From Within. I'm Yvette Blowitz, your host. Today's guest is Mary Frances O'Connor, a renowned grief expert, neuroscientist, psychologist, and the author of The Grieving Brain. In this podcast episode, Mary Frances O'Connor shares the groundbreaking discoveries about what happens in our brain when we grieve and how to navigate loss with more ease. I hope this podcast episode brings you comfort if you're grieving a loved one or any kind of loss. I also hope this podcast show allows you to learn, develop, and grow. Hi everyone, it's Yvette Blowitz from spiritgirl.com and welcome to Feel Good From Within. I'm super excited to be here with you today and with our very special guest, Mary Frances O'Connor, who is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Arizona, where she directs the Grief, Loss, and Social Stress Glass Lab, which investigates the effects of grief on the brain and the body. Mary Frances, welcome to Feel Good From Within. How are you today?
It's so lovely to be here, Yvette. Thank you for having me on.
I'm super grateful you're here with us today. And I want to also welcome our global audience. I'm so grateful you are here and you'll be tuning in to learn more about Grieving Brain. Before we dive into your book, are you happy to tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
I have been a grief researcher for over 20 years now, and it's really because I have this passionate curiosity about how the brain enables us to first create a bond with another person, and then how does it understand when that person has died. And it's really, for me, not just about what grief feels like, but about why does it hurt so much, and how is it that it takes so long. But at a personal level, I also experience grief myself. My mother was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer when I was 13 years old. And she wasn't expected to live more than the year, which I didn't know as a child. But she actually lived another 13 years, which meant that she died when I was 26, when I was a young adult. So I think that's meant that I just have always felt very comfortable with people who were grieving, and it has made it easy for me to bring people into my lab and interview them and then do neuroimaging studies and blood tests and so forth to really deeply try to understand what's happening during grieving.
And I'm sorry to hear about your mother. I did listen to that in your book by Audible, and you did mention that it was that life-changing event and losing your mother that had you asking these big questions about why and grief and what's happening within the brain. What is actually happening in the brain when we lose a loved one?
Well, I think in order to understand what's happening in the brain when we have grief, we first have to understand that when we create a bond with someone else, when we fall in love with our spouse or fall in love with our baby, that actually creates a bond in the brain, a physical encoding of that relationship of you're my one and only. Once we understand that that happens in the brain, then we can also understand that the brain has to update its understanding of the world when that loved one dies. In terms of creating the experience of grief, it requires lots of parts of the brain. It's very complex. We have lots of memories and emotions and thoughts that go along with it. But it's been helpful to even recognize that this is a process happening at a physiological level in our brain. And I think that helps partly to understand how it takes so long for us to learn that our loved one is gone, they're never coming back, and then what does that mean for our life?
And you talked about when we do lose a loved one, our brain is so overwhelmed and it can't comprehend someone that you might have had a morning coffee with every day or had a conversation with before going to bed or sleeping with in bed, that not only the bond, but those rituals is completely broken and the brain is just so overwhelmed it can't figure out what's going on.
That's right. The brain is really a prediction machine, right? It helps us to try and understand what might happen next based on what has happened before. The trouble is that when we are bonded to someone, it's our deep belief that I will always be there for you and you will always be there for me. And so that always part that is a part of a relationship, it doesn't just go away when the person dies. As you say, you wake up thousands of days next to someone, and then one morning you wake up and they're not next to you. It's actually not a very good prediction that they've died because we're used to people being absent for lots of reasons. That belief that the person is out there persists for a long time, even though we know rationally that the person has died. We might have a memory of being at the bedside, but that attachment belief that they're out there persists. And that's why we find ourselves doing things like picking up the phone to call someone and then realizing that we can't talk to them. It's every small habit that we have to relearn. And that's why I sometimes think grieving can be thought of as a form of learning.
And when we're going through grief, I remember when I lost loved ones that your mood instantly goes down, like you feel depressed, you can't concentrate, really emotional, crying. I remember waking up at night or early in the hours just sobbing, crying. And this went on and on. And this down low mood where everyone seemed really happy and
Mhm.
the world was getting on with it. And I just remember being at the grocery store in this dark, this cloud is over
Wow.
you,
Yeah.
thinking the whole world just keeps going.
Yeah.
Nothing stops. I remember even working on the farm at that time and I had lost my cousin,
Mm.
thinking the farm doesn't stop, the world doesn't stop, nothing stops. What is going on in terms of our mood? Does grief trigger depression or the feelings of depression? And if someone is feeling low, I know in my experience, in time it does get better. You do start to feel better. But there is that moment in time when you feel like, am I ever going to feel good again?
Yeah.
Is this going to pass?
Yeah.
Can you explain why we just go from this happy, everything's going well, and then we get the phone call that a loved one's died, and then it's boom, takes
Yeah.
us out like a tsunami.
It really does. That's a great description. And I think all those things you were talking about, feeling like the world is just going on as though nothing has happened, is a very common experience for people. And a lot of crying. We just cry a lot. Now, some people find they can't cry, and that's a different experience as well. What we think about as happening is it is though a part of us has been taken. It's just a natural response to being aware of that loss, that the person isn't there, that they won't be there in the future, that causes this intense reaction. And it is very natural. Fortunately, we don't lose close loved ones very often. And so it may be that there aren't many people around us who really understand what we're feeling. And that can feel very isolating and make you feel very alone. We see that grief and depression are actually distinct things. So, in both cases, you might feel sad, but depression is a disorder that is very global. So, you might feel sad about losing a loved one, but you might also feel guilty about not being a good daughter or fearful about what's going to happen to climate change. And also, you might think you're not a good worker. Depression is a very global experience. Grief is very specifically around the person who's died. So, one of the central feelings there is that yearning. And depression doesn't have yearning with it, those are a little bit different. However, you can become depressed when you are experiencing grief. You can have both. I like to make a distinction between grief and grieving because I think that can be helpful in understanding, is this ever going to feel better? Grief, is that moment. You described it as a tsunami, right? You're just completely overwhelmed. It seems unbearable that you're going to get through this moment, even. And grieving, on the other hand, is the way that that grief changes over time without going away. So grieving is change over time. Well, let me give you this as an example. The first 100 times you experience that tsunami of grief, as I say, you think to yourself, I'm not even going to get through this moment. And the 101st time, the grief feels equally bad, but you might think to yourself, this is familiar. I do know I'm going to get through this moment. You may learn ways to comfort yourself or to seek comfort from other people. That in and of itself is a change, even though you still have grief. So most of us experience less intense and less frequent waves of grief over time. And that is the way that grieving works. But it can be years and even decades after a loss, and you can still have a moment where you feel overwhelmed with grief. That doesn't mean you've done anything wrong in your grieving. It just means that in that moment, you're very aware of this loss. And the grieving has been a normal healing process. You're probably not feeling it as often, but it's okay to feel grief, just that natural human reaction, years and decades later.
What could someone do if they were experiencing grief or grieving around Christmas time because they've lost someone? Is there anything they could do to help self-soothe them?
So we know, even from the research, we can see it in the data, that it is absolutely true that people experience more grief around the holidays and anniversaries and birthdays. I think one of the things is just to know that it's normal. So your grieving may mean that you're not feeling grief as often. And so then around the holidays, you may think, oh my goodness, I feel worse. I thought I was doing really well. I thought I was coping pretty well. And now I feel all this grief again. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your coping. It just means there's all these reminders of the person. And when there are those reminders, we become aware of what we've lost, and then we feel grief. I think part of it is just being really compassionate with ourselves and recognizing this is how grief works. I am doing a normal human response to a terrible, terrible loss. I think that can be helpful. And then the other thing I think that can be helpful is to try and make a plan for how you're going to manage holiday events, for example, whether you're going to do traditional things that you've done in the past or whether you want to do something very different this year. And then having a plan B. So even once you make a plan, in the moment when you're supposed to go for dinner or go caroling or whatever the event is, in the moment, it may not feel like the right thing to do. Having a plan B and getting some support from the people around you. Well, I'm just going to come for half an hour, or I'm not going to come to the caroling, but I'll come to the thing afterward. Doing those kind of plan B things can mean that you're really responding to how you feel in the moment. And the surprising thing is sometimes when we push through and actually see people, seeing people can actually make us feel positive. That's a natural response to being around people who care for us. Sometimes it's okay to go and maybe not have the most happy time, but it can be a very meaningful time.
And I want to ask, there's this notion that if you lose someone, we should just get on with it, keep yourself busy at work, not think about it, and try and just forget about it and move on. Is this trying not to think about it and just keeping ourselves really active and really busy so we can't think about it or experiencing the natural emotions, delaying our grief?
I think that what's important is that we have a big toolkit of ways of coping so that it may be perfectly fine on the day that you have a big presentation at work that you think to yourself, you know what, I'm not going to think about this person who's died at all. I'm going to just shut off the tears. I'm going to go in. I'm going to do, my sort of even robot kind of work because that's what is called for in the moment. But if you do that all the time, if you're constantly trying to avoid and distract yourself from your feelings, it's probably the case that they're not going to change very much. And so you'll have to keep doing that. But on the other hand, if you have other coping skills, then sometimes you might avoid or distract yourself. But at other times, you might allow yourself to think about what does it really mean for your life that this person is gone? What is it that you've learned or that you want to take forward to honor the values of this person? I think about my mother and sort of the things that she stood for. And sometimes when I'm doing things, I think, Mom, this one's for you. Having moments where you're processing the experience that you're having, you're really experiencing how life is different now than it was before. That can be very sad and it can lead to a lot of yearning, but it can also really help us to understand, have a gratitude for life, to really understand others around us who also might be grieving, or to feel that life is very precious and time is short. And so we want to achieve goals that we had been putting off. There are so many possible things that people can learn when they're going through grief. If they have some period of time when they allow themselves to feel the grief and what they're learning because of it. And they have other times when it's okay to take a break. Grieving is really stressful for your body. And so taking a break, going out to a party, going to a movie, there's nothing wrong with that as one of the many coping.
When it comes to grief, is journaling an effective coping tool that we could use?
So the key, I think, with journaling, which can be very helpful for people to sort of put down in black and white how it is that they're feeling right now. Journaling can be extremely helpful, but it is also sometimes the case that journaling can lead to what we call rumination. And so rumination is where you have these thoughts that are the same over and over and over again. One of the common versions of rumination that we see is what we call the would've, should've, could've thoughts. The doctor should have run another test, or if only I could have gotten them to the hospital sooner, or if only they would have. But all of those stories, even if we're writing them down again and again, and how we're feeling maybe guilt, all of those stories actually end in, and then my loved one would have lived. But the reality is that they didn't live. Being lost in these stories over and over again, it actually isn't helping us to understand the present moment, to be in the present moment. And that is where life is happening. There's no real answer to any of those questions. And so finding a way around those questions back into what is happening in my life right now, who is important to me, what are the things that I think are important to be doing, then that in many ways can help us to start to restore a meaningful life for ourselves.
And would you say for someone who's experiencing grief that taking care of themselves with self-care is so important?
Self-care is incredibly important. We know that, as I said, grief is stressful for us. Knowing that it makes sense to try to eat very well, try to have a regular sleep pattern, even if you have difficulty sleeping, doing things that feel physically soothing, going for a walk, doing meditation, doing yoga. These are things that will help us as we are going through this stressful experience. And self-care, I think, is really partly about paying attention to how we're feeling and paying attention to what actually makes us feel calmer or more comforted, and then finding ways to incorporate that into our life.
I love that. And most recently, we lost a really close family friend, and my grandmother at 96 sadly has passed away.
Yeah.
But what I discovered when two people that were so significant in my life passed away literally within a day, I
Wow.
honestly thought, oh, I don't know how I'm going to get through this. I went for my walk. I felt really sad, really upset. Had my sunglasses on, but I was like, no, I got to do a walk that'll help me feel better. I sat on the beach and I listened to the ocean and I found that nature was very comforting.
Yeah.
Have you found that within your research as well, that we can find comfort from being in nature?
I don't have any research personally about this, but I think it makes a lot of sense. When a loved one dies, it can feel like the rug just got ripped out from under you. And I think it is helpful often to turn to things that feel very enduring in a moment that feels so tender and fragile. I think nature is often one of those things that feels universal. It feels forever. The ocean is always going to be there, and the sun and the stars are always going to be there. And so, in a moment, I think that we can feel a lot of human frailty by turning to these bigger experiences. I think can be very helpful for some people.
And it's interesting you mentioned getting together with people because I was having a really down day, a grief day, grieving day. And I honestly originally had organized this dinner and I definitely didn't feel like it. I was sitting on the couch feeling horrible. But then when I did have the dinner with my mum, and then we watched a movie after this dinner and movie night, we had moments of laughter. It was quite heartwarming and it kind of helped to shift those sad feelings. So
Yeah.
I found that very therapeutic.
A lot of people think I shouldn't feel good. I should be feeling a lot of grief and sadness, but there's really no big book of rules. There's no grief rules book. It turns out that feeling connected to another person, which often involves laughter, can be one of the things that is most soothing for us. There's nothing wrong with having that soothing experience of connecting with other people. We often think, I'm not going to be able to feel that way. But often, when we're watching a funny movie or we're eating good food and telling stories together, we discover that we can actually feel that way, even though we might then feel grief again later.
You're so right, because there was no way I imagined I'd even feel good again that day or have a moment of feeling good. I honestly thought, when is this feeling of grief and loss and sadness and feeling depressed and low and crying eyes, these watery eyes, gonna finish? I
Yeah.
thought this could go on forever and ever.
Well, I think it is like that. Grief is a little bit like jumping into a puddle and then jumping out of it again. And when you're in the puddle, of course, you're completely wet, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a way to then also jump out of it. I think of emotions this way: they're going to arise, but they're also like the waves, they're going to recede. In the moment when you're at the middle of that wave, it feels like it will be that way forever. And so having hope and faith in that moment that the wave is going to recede again can be very helpful.
And is it very common when we can have these thoughts where we don't want to accept the news? We don't want to believe it's true. We honestly go through a period of feeling shocked. It's like our brain, it's in shock.
Yeah. This is definitely an experience that a lot of people have. And for some people, they'll describe even days and weeks afterward, feel like he's just going to walk through the door again. That disbelief and even just straight out denial, this can't be true. These are absolutely experiences that people have. Having said that, I just want to add that denial is often described as one of the first of the 5 stages of grief that was brought to the world's attention by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And I want to say that it's become clear through more recent scientific work that those are not stages that we move through in a linear way where we do all of denial and then there's all of anger and all of depression. And once you get to depression, you're never going to have anger again. we know now that what she was doing was what all scientists do initially, which was to describe. And all of those are feelings that often come with grief, including acceptance that she described as well. But it's not a prescription for grieving. It doesn't mean do it in this order. It doesn't mean that you will have all of these experiences, but rather here are some of the experiences that people have when they're grieving. So we don't actually use the 5 stages of grief anymore because we know now that grief comes and goes in waves and improves over time, but not in a linear way.
I'm glad you clarified that. And the reason being is I remember being told about these 5 stages of grief. And at the time, I was like, oh, I missed one of the stages. When is that stage going to happen?
Yeah.
Is it very unique for each individual as well? One person might experience shock initially, but the second person who's received the same phone call might be experiencing anger. So each person might be experiencing all these different emotions, but they've received the same phone call of losing a loved one.
That's exactly right. Grief is very individual. And even the things that I'm saying today, I may be an expert on grief, but you're an expert on you. If what I'm saying makes sense to you, that's wonderful. And if you find something useful about it, I'm delighted. But if you don't, it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. So there are also people who don't experience much grief at all when a loved one dies. And they think, oh my God, there must be something terribly wrong with me. But that is simply the way it is for some people. For some people, acceptance comes really quickly. I think what's important is we all are having an individual experience, even with the same event. And hopefully that can help us to have a little compassion for each other. There's no underlying intention there. If you feel anger, you feel anger, but it doesn't make your grief better or worse than a person who's not feeling anger or who's moved into acceptance more rapidly than we would expect them to.
And in your experience through your research, have you found that someone who was already experiencing, as an example, depression or maybe bipolar, that on top of that, when they experience loss and grief, that's when they need extra support? Whereas someone who wasn't going through that may be able to bounce back a little bit quicker.
Absolutely. So having a personal history, as you're describing, that can increase the severity of a person's grief, but it also, as you say, can be a trigger. So, for example, a person who has bipolar disorder, who may have been doing pretty well and been fairly stable, the death of a loved one is a huge stressor, right? That's an enormous event in our life. And it can set off in a person who already has periods of mental health issues. It can set off one of those periods. And so if you know that you have personal history of mental illness, it does make sense to ensure that when you experience grief, that you have the care around you in place to really try and support you through that.
And do you think that if someone's going through grief, that talking to someone can help, like a therapist or a counselor?
I think that talking in general is often a good idea during grief. Grief can be a very private experience. And so what we're experiencing can be very normal, but unless you talk with someone else about it, you're not going to discover that it's very normal. And you may think, oh, why am I having these weird thoughts? Or I find myself doing things that I'm not expecting myself to do. So talking can be very helpful just in even understanding the range of experiences that people have when they're grieving that are all very normal and very typical, but we don't talk about very much. In addition to that, it can be helpful to talk about it just because this person was so important in your life. And sometimes we feel the need to express how important they were and to really try to tell those around us the impact that that had for us. So that's another way that I think expressing yourself can be really useful. I think that it is not necessary always to see a therapist when we're grieving. It certainly is a natural healing process, and most of us are quite resilient with the support of friends and family. But if you are struggling with grief, then absolutely someone who is skilled in understanding emotions and grief specifically can be very helpful. To have someone to talk with you about skills you may not have considered, growing your coping strategies toolkit in ways you might not have done before. If you get stuck in some set of thoughts, like the would have, should have, could have, it can be helpful to have a therapist there who can teach you more skills about how to respond to your own thoughts and how to manage periods of rumination. So I think therapy can be incredibly helpful, but I would not say it's necessary for everyone.
And when it comes to your research, what has been one of the most surprising things that you have discovered along your journey as a neuroscientist?
I think one of the most surprising things is that one of the very tiny areas of the brain that I discovered in functional neuroimaging as being important during grieving, this little area is called the nucleus accumbens. It turned out that in animal research, where the scientists are looking at voles who mate for life, so pair bond with each other, this exact same area of the brain is important in their bonding, and that we see changes when they're separated from each other. And I think that's just remarkable that our brains could be conserved across evolution that way, that we could actually be having some of the same experiences as even animals when they're experiencing separation from loved ones. I think finding that makes me realize just how normal grief really is, and that it is a process happening in our brain as well as our mind. And so it takes time. Physically, it takes time to update our understanding of the world.
And you included that in your book, The Grieving Brain, which was very interesting. And I really found fascinating that you started back in an era where MRI was new, and you were really just at the start of this trying to figure out what was going on within the brain, what was involved and happening in the brain when it comes to grief and loss. What inspired you to write The Grieving Brain, your book? And what is the meaning behind your title?
I have a chance to read grief research every day. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model came out in 1969, and science has come a long way since then. So every day I'm in the middle of designing new experiments and analyzing data of interviews with grieving people and reading my colleagues' work where they're doing studies on grief and grieving. And that's all wonderful and has certainly impacted me personally as well as a scientist. But I realized that this information was not getting into the hands of the people who could actually use it. Writing the book for me was really like turning to the person next to you on the airplane and just having a conversation about how grief and grieving work so that they can take whatever part of that might be useful to them in understanding their own experience and maybe thinking about their grief in new ways. The science of how we learn from love and loss is because the science has to both understand how the bond, how the love develops, then also the science of how the brain understands that learning process when we're grieving.
And in your book, you also mentioned that we can grieve loss of a celebrity or a musician, someone that we maybe have seen on TV, and that this can be a universal grief, even though we've never met the celebrity or the musician in person.
It's true. We call this parasocial grieving. And it turns out that when we really connect with an artist, whether that's a musician or a writer, sometimes even when we really connect with the ideas of a politician, we form a sort of bond with them if they're a very public figure. We actually know a lot about public figures, or at least we know a lot about what they share with us. What's interesting is when that person dies, there's a way in which there's a piece of our life or a piece of what it was that we connected with, the lyrics where they said what we were feeling in a way that we never imagined someone would express. We lose a little piece of that, which feels a lot like grief because we're losing something that we were very connected to.
We saw this with the outpouring of love for the Queen Elizabeth II, the outpouring of grief
Yes.
right across the world. And also with Olivia Newton-John,
Yeah.
who was in the movie originally, Grease, with John Travolta. What is your hope for your newfound book readers?
My biggest hope is that reading the book or listening to podcasts like this gives us an opportunity to start a conversation so that it's easier to say to a friend, maybe, I was listening to this podcast or I was reading this book and it made me think about this that happened when my mom died, or it made me wonder how you've been doing since your dad died. I think that if these types of books and discussions can lead to us talking one-on-one, can really help us to understand what grief is like and find a way to really connect with other people.
Because sometimes you want to avoid people if they've lost a loved one, but it's a little bit easier these days just to go, thinking of you, condolences, which is a lovely gesture.
Absolutely.
However, do you think going that one step further where human connection can have even a more empowering effect?
Yes. The thing you were describing at the beginning, it feels like the world is just going on around you and no one is noticing that this important person is missing. I think that when we are willing to reach out and say, hey, I know that this thing has happened to you and I'm wondering how things are going, that can be incredibly useful. And I think one of the reasons that we avoid doing that is we know that it's going to be difficult to be with someone who is suffering, but it isn't our job to cheer them up, right? That's not the goal of being with a person who is grieving. The goal is simply to be there with them, to hear what it is that they have to say, or maybe they don't want to say anything, and to go for a walk with them or go for a drive with them, to simply be with them in whatever it is that they're experiencing. And to know that for most grieving people, it's like the volume dial got turned up on all your emotions. People may seem really irritable, for example, or people may cry. And it's important to remember that's not because of something you did. It's simply how they are feeling right now. Knowing that can take some of the pressure off. It's okay to say, listen, I don't really know what to say right now, but I know that you're hurting and I am here with you and I'm going to be here. I'm going to be around if you need me until you get to another place in your life where you can see a meaningful future. I think that those conversations are incredibly helpful for the person who's grieving and can make us feel that we ourselves have some skill, some ability, some connection to just be calm ourselves and let the person be whoever they are in that moment.
I love that message. Be with them. We're not responsible for cheering them up. All we need to do is be with them and accept them in the moment. And even if they are angry, irritable, crying, it's not us. It's part of the grieving process.
I'll give you one example.
Yes.
A student of mine, she and her boyfriend knew that their next door neighbor's husband had died. They were an elderly couple who had been together for many, 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 many years. And this woman's boyfriend went over near Christmas time, knocked on the door and said, listen, I know your husband put up Christmas lights every year, and I just thought I'd see if you might like me to put them up for you this year. And she said, no, I don't need any help. And she slammed slammed the door and he thought, oh God, I've done the wrong thing. How could I be so insensitive? This is awful, and went away. And about 24 hours later, she came over next door and she said, I am so sorry. It's just so hard for me to think that he isn't here, that he can't do that for me, that I couldn't even understand the kind offer you were making. And that in fact, I would love it if you would help me put up Christmas lights this year. And so that's a great example where in the moment you may feel like you did the wrong thing, but in the long run, it is showing support and love that really matters.
I love that story. That is so beautiful. You give so much in your field of work. I know we talked before I hit the record button. You're like the godmother of grief. Many other grief therapists or people who work in the field refer to your pioneering work and the research you do. But how do you take care of your own self? And what are some of your self-care rituals?
I think about this a lot, and especially since the book came out, of course, I talk about grief a lot every day. And I recently have had a very close friend and they've had a baby. And I said, look, on the weekend, I want to spend a couple hours taking care of this incredible newborn baby. I can't think of anything that is more balancing from the grief side of life to this new, perfect, little living, developing, growing baby. So that's an example of something that I do to make sure that there's a lot of balance in my life with good things and hard things and all very meaningful things.
Love that. And how can we stay in touch with you after this podcast show?
I have a website, maryfrancesoconnor.org, where you can see some more about my research and about the book. And then I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram as well.
Thank you, Mary Frances O'Connor. I'm so grateful you went to all of the effort to write your book, The Grieving Brain, The Surprising Science of How We Learn from Love and Loss. It was an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast show. I totally recommend if anyone is going through grief or grieving or just wanting to learn more about what's going on, and definitely if you're a grief therapist or psychologist or work in mental health and it's your role to support people in grief, I found your book to be an incredible resource of learning, and I learned so much. But what I really loved was learning more about you as the author and your own personal journey of sadly losing your mum, but how that loss really shaped where we are here today with your book, The Grieving Brain, and how much that loss of your mother has shaped who you are today as a person, but also been a very pivotal part of your work.
Thank you. These are really kind words. And I'm really grateful to you for bringing this conversation to people. It's so important.
I love the work you do. So thank you, Mary Frances O'Connor. You're incredible and you're really making a difference in the world.
Thank you, Yvette.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening into this podcast episode. I hope you found this conversation of interest and of benefit to you. In support, I would love for you to subscribe to Feel Good From Within with Yvette Lee Blowitz, SPAITGIRL podcast, and to also leave a 5-star rating and a review of what you think too. Be sure to share this show with your family, friends, and community, and to also subscribe to my mailing list at SPAITGIRL.com, YvetteLeeBlowitz.com, or FeelGoodFromWithin.com, and to follow SPAITGIRL, Yvette Lee Blowitz, or Feel Good From Within on any social media app. And together, let's feel good from within.